Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appears to be trying to be a bit more conciliatory at the NATO summit underway in Lithuania. Earlier this week, he said the decision by NATO leaders not to issue a timeline that would determine how and when Ukraine would join NATO was unprecedented and absurd. Now, a day later, he says it's been a good summit. NATO has a clause in its founding document called Article 5. It says if one country is attacked, all of the members' countries consider that an attack. In other words, I suppose if Ukraine joined NATO now, it would mean a NATO country has been invaded by Russia. Imagine the consequences. Roland Henwood, a political commentator, an observer of international events at the University of Pretoria. Roland, good afternoon to you. I don't really want to imagine the consequences. I mean, surely Ukraine was never going to be invited as a member of NATO at this summit.
Good afternoon, Stephen. No, I think that was an unrealistic expectation. What one looks at is Mr. Zelensky trying to negotiate as much as possible, and in effect, he has nothing to give. I mean, he's got his country at war. He's providing soldiers. He's pushing the war effort, and that's what he can give. But he has to negotiate to get what he needs. And I think this is part of that negotiating strategy. So he tries to play, in a sense, hardball, but he's got nothing to play with, and he's actually doing an amicable job of actually achieving what he needs because he's got nothing to play with.
I mean, then he really needs NATO. I mean, without NATO, and I suppose particularly without the US, he and his country are in an impossible position.
Yes, he's fully dependent on NATO, and fully dependent on NATO with the United States of America. And because of that, he cannot offend to the point where he alienates. And it's a fine line that he's playing, trying to push as much as possible, but realizing the limits and his complete dependence on NATO. And yes, NATO membership is just too far to go. It doesn't make sense in a practical way. Ukraine does not comply with the requirements of membership, and probably won't achieve that easily in the short term. And then secondly, as you referred to the fact that if Ukraine is a member of NATO, then NATO is at war with Russia. And that is not a scenario that especially President Biden wants to engage in.
It's been fascinating to watch just some of the visuals, some of the way that leaders meet each other. And it's interesting, you had a big rally yesterday where Zelensky spoke in Lithuania. How many people in Lithuania came out to show their support for him? You see this with Western leaders all the time. They all want to be photographed with Zelensky. What does this tell us about how Ukraine and Zelensky are a symbol of something that the West supports? I mean, clearly politicians are doing this because they want their voters to see them with Zelensky.
Yes, Zelensky, I think, is probably a study in leadership and negotiation skills where you literally have nothing that you can put on the table, but he keeps on achieving. He keeps on getting more support. He gets on more military equipment, training, and he's moving the boundaries from where the war started continuously. And I think his persona is grown in such a way that he's the kind of leader that everybody wants to associate with. He's doing what very few leaders can achieve at this stage. And I think that is why he is the person to be seen with. But there's also another message in that, and that is that NATO is more united than probably ever in its history. And not only united symbolically, but united in action and united in taking decisions, united in doing and sending a very powerful message in the European context. And we must remember NATO is not a global role player. It's a regional role player. It's a European role player mostly. And the message they're sending are for people in Europe and the European context. And that is quite important given what is happening not only in Ukraine but also politically within the rest of Europe.
Isn't it really, I mean, you talk about Zelensky's popularity in the West, isn't it really about the actions of Russia? People are supporting Zelensky just to show that they're opposed to Russia, and NATO, again, united because of the actions of Russia. If there hadn't been an invasion, I mean, could NATO be in a very different space?
Yes, I mean, NATO was, what did President Macron said, 2-3 years ago, that NATO is brain dead. Mr. Trump was basically telling NATO to pack up and go. The US is no longer going to play the role it has played. So there's a huge change in the fortunes of NATO. But because of that, and because of the leadership shown by Zelensky and others, President Biden and European leaders, and yes, it's a response to what Russia has done, but I think the response is way beyond what everyone expected, and the lasting impact of this is probably also going to be way beyond what Russia, Putin specifically expected, but probably also what others expected when this conflict started.
So when NATO now says that Ukraine can join NATO when the conditions are right, is how it's been said in English, what does that mean? Does it really mean only when the war is over?
Firstly, it's going to be when the war is over, when there's some form of settlement to the war, peace in some way. But it also implies systems of governance, and especially the long-running problem of massive corruption that has been part of politics in Ukraine. And then you get to the developments of the military itself, which is being fast-tracked at this stage. If you want to become a member of NATO, you have to tick all the boxes in terms of compatible equipment, compatible training, compatible doctrine, and Ukraine is only now starting to act in that context. I mean, so far Ukraine has been following Russian doctrine, using Russian equipment. The war has fast-tracked that process of changing over to European and NATO standard equipment and NATO standard approaches.
You talk about the sort of study in the leadership style of Volodymyr Zelensky. There's another leader at NATO who's been quite interesting for various reasons. I'm not talking about Biden. I'm talking about the president of Turkey, President Recep Erdogan. He found himself going into the summit really holding a veto on whether Sweden could join NATO. There's a complicated backstory to all of this. But Erdogan is at the NATO summit, playing an important role there. He also has a relationship with Russia. The images of him at the NATO summit, what do you think that does to his relationship with President Putin?
Well, it may, in a way, I think, explain the role that he is playing, shuttling between Ukraine and Russia, and he's probably been the most effective leader in getting some form of communication or keeping open some form of communication between Ukraine and Russia. And that is a very important role that he plays, and few others, if any, can actually come close to that. So all the other aspiring people who want to make peace, my sense is that it's going to need somebody such as Erdogan on your side if you want to really make progress. But Erdogan had a lot to lose in this process, and he may have overplayed his hand a little bit, and he started to, I think, feel the heat because he started to offend and alienate Washington. He tried to push firstly domestic politics and his relationship with Sweden, domestic politics in Turkey, but then also came with the demand that he will support Swedish membership, but he wants an open door into EU membership, which is something that Turkey always wanted. And that door has been closed because of the problems in Turkey with democracy and the democratic standards that EU membership requires. And he seems to have backtracked on all of those, and Sweden is now going to formally join because he lifted the veto. So I'm not sure that he achieved much in terms of what he wanted to achieve. One would have to see what the details will be in terms of the bilateral relationship with Sweden. But that he plays an important role in the context of the Russia-Ukraine dynamic and communication, I think that is not even up for debate.
Roland Henwood, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time. A commentator at the University of Pretoria.